thin mist sits low over the grasslands of the American bottom, and a single great hill catches the first light. It is too steep, too square, too deliberate to be the work of weather or water. It is not a hill at all. It is the largest earthen monument in the Americas, raised basket of soil by basket of soil, by human hands, 1,000 years ago, at the heart of a vanished city that once rivaled the capitals of Europe. The land around it is quiet now. A 2-lane road runs past the foot of the mound. Beyond it lie warehouses, rail lines, the distant towers of a riverboat casino, and the low, ceaseless hum of interstate traffic carrying people towards St. Louis, without a reason to slow down. Most of them never learn that they have just crossed the center of a lost metropolis. They have passed the place where, for a few centuries, more people lived than anywhere else on the continent north of Mexico. This is Cahokia. The name is not the one its builders used. That name, the word those thousands of people spoke when they meant home, was never written down, and it did not survive. Cahokia is a later borrowing, taken from a different tribe who lived in the area when French missionaries arrived, and attached to the ruins for want of anything better. The true name is one of the many things the city carried with it into silence. What it left behind is earth. More than 100 mounds once stood across the floodplain, some long since flattened by 2 centuries of ploughing, others still rising in clean geometric tiers from the bottomland. The greatest of them is the one the morning light is touching now. Later settlers called it Monk's Mound, after a small community of Trappist monks who briefly gardened on its lower terraces. It covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It climbs in 4 broad terraces to a height of 100 feet, and every ounce of it, an estimated 22 million cubic feet of soil, was carried there by people, one woven basket at a time. To stand at its foot is to feel the weight of an idea. Something drove a society without wheels, without draft animals, without iron tools, to move a small mountain by hand, and to do it not across 1,000 slow years, but within a handful of generations. The question that has drawn researchers back to this floodplain for more than a century is simple to ask and very hard to answer. Who were these people, and what became of them? The scale is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind, because it sits so far outside the story most people were ever taught. The conventional image of North America before Columbus is one of small, scattered communities, bands of hunters, modest farming hamlets, peoples living lightly across a wide and largely empty land. Cahokia does not fit that image at all. At its height, around the year 1100, the city and the dense ring of settlements around it may have held 20,000 people, and by some estimates more. The comparisons are worth pausing on. London, at that same moment in history, held a population in a broadly similar range. Cahokia was larger than the Paris of its day in sheer numbers of people gathered in one place. And no city within the bounds of what would become the United States would match its population again until Philadelphia, in the years around 1,800, 7 centuries later. For 700 years, the largest city the future United States had ever contained was one that had already been abandoned and whose very existence had been forgotten. It was not a village that simply swelled. It was a planned city, with a center and a grid, with monuments aligned to the movements of the sun and moon, with neighborhoods, plazas, suburbs, and satellite towns spread for miles along the floodplain, across the river, beneath what is now the city of St. Louis, stood another great mound group, so prominent that 19th century residents called their town the Mound City before they leveled almost all of it to build. Between the two lay a third cluster, at present-day East St. Louis. Together, they formed one of the densest concentrations of monumental building anywhere in the ancient world outside of Mesoamerica. The mounds across the river would pay the heaviest price for the forgetting that came later, where downtown Street, Louis now stands. Dozens of mounds once rose. Through the 19th century they were carted away piece by piece, their earth used as fill for streets, railways, and the growing riverfront, until almost nothing remained and the city's old nickname, the Mound City, became a name for something that was no longer there to see. At present-day East St. Louis, a second great precinct of mounds met a similar end beneath rail yards and factories. Even the heart of Cahokia itself came close to being lost. In the 20th century, a modern highway was driven straight across the site, cutting through buried neighborhoods, before the full scale of what lay beneath the grass was understood. That as much survived as did is something close to an accident of history. Cahokia had a skyline. A traveler approaching across the prairie would have seen the great mound rising against the sky, a building crowning its summit, and around it scores of lesser platforms, and the smoke of thousands of household fires hanging low over the bottomland. To anyone arriving on foot, after days of walking through a world of villages, the effect must have been overwhelming. A place unlike anywhere else they had ever been or would ever go. And then, within a few centuries of its founding, all of it came apart. By around the year 1350, the grand plaza stood empty. The temples on the mounds were gone. The thousands of houses had been abandoned, their timbers rotted into the soil or consumed by fire. The fields had returned to grass and cane. When Europeans finally pushed up this stretch of the Mississippi, centuries later still, they found the mounds but no city, and no living memory of one. The native peoples then living nearby could not tell them who had raised the great earthworks, because their own immediate ancestors had not. The builders had dispersed generations before, and their descendants had carried the story away with them, or allowed it to fade into legend. That silence, a monument with no remembered author, would have strange and damaging consequences. In the early 19th century, as settlers spread through the mound country of the Mississippi and Ohio valleys, many simply refused to believe that the ancestors of Native Americans could have built such things. They preferred to imagine a vanished race, instead lost tribes of Israel, wandering Welsh princes, a superior civilization destroyed by the peoples who came after. It was a convenient fiction for a nation in the very act of seizing the land, and undoing it would take decades of careful work, but that reckoning belongs later in this story. There is an irony in that forgetting, because the city had not always been invisible. In 1811, a young lawyer and traveller named Henry Brackenridge climbed Monk's Mound, looked out over the scattered earthworks of the floodplain, and understood at once that he was standing in the ruins of something vast, a population, he wrote, that must once have been immense. He compared the site to the great mounds of the old world. Almost no one listened. The idea did not fit the story the country wished to tell about itself, and so the largest ancient city north of Mexico slipped, for the better part of 2 centuries, out of the national mind. For now, hold that image, a capital larger than London, emptied and forgotten so completely that those who came after could not even guess its name. To understand how that was possible, the story has to return to the beginning, to the moment when the city was not yet there at all. Rewind, then, to the middle of the 11th century. The place is the same, the broad, fertile floodplain, where the Missouri and the Illinois pour their waters into the Mississippi, a stretch of bottomland that French explorers would one day name the American bottom. The land is generous. Spring floods lay down fresh silt across the lowlands. Oxbow lakes and backwater swamps teem with fish, turtles, and waterfowl. The bluffs at the valley's edge hold deer, timber, and stone. For a people who had learned to farm maize, it was close to ideal ground. But before, about the year 1050, there was no city here. There were villages, a scattering of small farming communities, much like hundreds of others spread along the rivers of the eastern woodlands. People grew maize and squash and a handful of native seed crops, lived in modest houses of pole and thatch, buried their dead close to home, and ordered their lives at the scale of the household and the kin group. There were older and larger ceremonial centers elsewhere. The tradition of building mounds in this part of the world reached back thousands of years before Cahokia existed, but nothing on this particular floodplain yet hinted at what was about to happen. The deeper background matters because Cahokia did not appear out of nothing. Across the preceding centuries, two quiet revolutions had been working their way through the eastern woodlands. The first was maize. Corn had traveled north from Mexico over a very long time, and somewhere in the centuries before Cahokia, it became not just one food among many, but the staple, the crop a whole society could be built upon. The second was the bow and the arrow, which reshaped both hunting and war. By the time the 11th century arrived, the people of the river valleys were farming more intensively than their ancestors, living in larger and more permanent settlements, and beginning to organize themselves in new and more layered ways. The stage, in other words, was set, but a stage is not a play. It helps to understand what kind of world was taking shape, because Cahokia would become the center of something far larger than itself. Archaeologists call that wider world the Mississippian culture, a way of life that spread across much of the American Southeast and mid-continent in the centuries that followed, marked everywhere by the same signature elements: flat-topped platform mounds arranged around open plazas, an economy built on maize, ranked societies led by powerful chiefs, and a shared body of sacred art and symbol. Cahokia was its earliest and grandest expression, the place where the whole pattern seems to have come together before radiating outward along the rivers. To call it merely a city undersells what it was. It was a capital, a holy place, and the engine of a cultural transformation whose influence would eventually reach peoples 1,000 miles away. And then, in the span of a single generation, the play began. The archaeologist Timothy Porketat gave the moment a name that has stuck: Cahokia's Big Bang. The phrase endures because the evidence really does look less like slow, organic growth than like a sudden detonation of effort, faith, and ambition. Around the year 1050, the scattered villages of the central floodplain were cleared away or absorbed, and in their place a city was deliberately laid out, almost all at once. The fingerprints of planning are everywhere in the ground. The older houses, built in one style, were replaced across the whole district by dwellings of a new and standardized kind, set in neat rows along shared alignments. A vast open space at the heart of the new city was cleared and leveled the Grand Plaza, roughly 50 acres of carefully engineered ground. The plaza was not a natural meadow. Excavation has shown that the builders cut down the high spots and and filled in the low ones, hauling and packing soil until they had made a flat, formal expanse the size of dozens of modern city blocks, a stage built to hold crowds in the thousands. The entire layout answered to the cardinal directions and to the sky. Mounds, plazas, and avenues were arranged on a grid keyed to north, south, east, and west, and tilted just slightly off true north on a deliberate bearing, an alignment that appears to track the movements of the sun across the year and, some argue, the longer cycles of the moon. This was not a settlement that had simply grown wherever the ground allowed. It was a designed thing, a vision imposed upon the floodplain by people who carried in their minds a clear and shared picture of what a city, their city, the center of their world, was meant to be. To raise such a place, they needed people, and people came. The population of the American bottom swelled with startling speed in the decades after 1050. Some of that growth came from the surrounding villages, drawn or driven into the rising center, but a great deal of it came from much farther away. When researchers study the teeth and bones of those buried at Cahokia, reading the chemical signatures that the local water and soil leave in a body during childhood, they find that a striking share of the city's residents were not born on the floodplain at all. They had come from elsewhere, sometimes from a considerable distance, and made their lives in the new capital. It is one of the more haunting facts the mounds have yielded. Cahokia was a city of migrants. People left the places where their families had lived for generations and traveled to a center that promised them something: opportunity, protection, belonging, or a share in whatever powerful new vision had taken root on the floodplain. What exactly pulled them in is a question the silent earth will not fully answer. Something happened here around 1050 that persuaded tens of thousands of people to pour their labor, their loyalty, and their lives into a single shared undertaking. The explanations that scholars reach for tend to circle the same few possibilities. Perhaps it began as a religious awakening, a new way of understanding the cosmos, compelling enough to draw pilgrims across the mid-continent. Perhaps it was a political triumph, a leader, or a lineage that gathered unprecedented power. Perhaps, as some have wondered, it was sparked in part by a sign in the heavens. In the year 1054, sky watchers across the world recorded a brilliant new star, the supernova that left behind what astronomers now call the Crab Nebula, bright enough to be seen in daylight for weeks. Whether the people of the floodplain read meaning into that blaze of light, no one can say with certainty. But the timing, on the edge of the Big Bang, has been impossible for some to ignore. Whatever the true cause, the result was the same: a capital conjured almost from nothing, on the strength of an idea. The timing owed something to the weather, too. The Rise of Cahokia fell within a long stretch of unusually favorable climate across the mid-continent, the warm, comparatively stable centuries, sometimes called the medieval climatic anomaly. For the farmers of the American bottom, it meant dependable rains and generous growing seasons. Maize, already spreading through the woodlands, came fully into its own here. The floodplain's renewed soils, worked by tens of thousands of hands, could yield surpluses large enough to feed a population that no longer grew all of its own food. The builders, the priests, the craftspeople, the rulers, and the constant stream of visitors. Maize did more than fill stomachs. A food surplus is the quiet foundation beneath every early city in human history. It releases some people from the daily search for food and lets them spend their days on other things, carrying earth for a monument, shaping pottery, conducting ceremonies, governing, trading, making war. The granaries of Cahokia, stocked with the corn of the bottomland and supplemented by the squash, the seed crops, the fish of the backwaters, and the deer of the bluffs, were what made everything else possible. In a real sense, the great mounds rose on a foundation of maize. That favorable climate, though, carried a hidden edge, and it is worth marking here because it will return before the story is done. The same warm centuries that made the fields rich would not last. The rains that watered the maize would, in time, begin to fail. And the great river that nourished the floodplain with fresh silt each spring was also capable, on a long enough timescale, of something far less gentle than a gift of soil. The very conditions that built Cahokia held within them, quietly, the conditions that would one day help unmake it. But that turning point lay 2 centuries in the future. At the city's founding, none of it was visible. There was only the rising capital, and a sense almost audible across the bottomland of a people in the midst of something without precedent. What did that founding generation actually do? Day after day, they surveyed. Lines were laid across the floodplain with a precision that still impresses the engineers who study them. The Great Mound, the Plaza, and the principal avenue set out on that deliberate, slightly canted bearing the planners had chosen. They cleared, old houses came down, old ground was opened and remade. They dug and they carried. The endless basket loads of earth that would become the mounds began, season by season, to move, and they gathered, in numbers the region had never witnessed, into a single place built expressly to hold a crowd. Some of that gathering left a vivid trace in the ground. Beneath one of the city's mounds, archaeologists found the remains of an enormous feast, a great pit packed with the bones of thousands of deer, the residue of tobacco and other ceremonial plants, the broken pottery and discarded remnants of an event on a colossal scale. It was the rubbish of a celebration, but a celebration that may have gathered much of the new city's population at once, binding strangers into a single people through shared food, shared ritual, and shared awe. Cities are not built by labor alone. They are built by belief and by the bonds that great gatherings forge, and Cahokia, at its founding, seems to have understood that as well as any society ever has. The earth for all of it had to come from somewhere. As the mounds climbed, broad pits opened across the city where the soil had been dug away, the borrow pits, some of which later filled with water to become ponds within the city itself. And the builders did not simply heap the spoil. They chose their soils with evident care, layering different earths for strength, packing alternating courses of wet clay and dry sand, so that the great platforms would hold their shape and shed the seasonal rain rather than slump under it. This was engineering, carried out by people who knew their materials intimately and who were prepared to move millions of basket loads of the floodplain to see a vision made solid and permanent. The labor is almost beyond reckoning. A single large mound might represent hundreds of thousands of individual journeys, each one a person bending to fill a basket, lifting it, climbing, and emptying it onto the growing platform, over and over, across years. It is not hard to imagine the sheer noise of it. The making of Cahokia would not have been a quiet thing. It would have been the sound of thousands at work, and at worship the thud of digging sticks in heavy soil, the calls of the work gangs, the smoke of clearing fires drifting across the bottom, the rhythm of construction that went on, year after year. As the plaza was leveled and the first great platforms began to climb toward the sky, a whole society had turned itself toward a single task, and the floodplain that had so recently held a string of ordinary villages now held the beginnings of a capital. By the close of that first transforming generation, the shape of the city was set. At its heart lay the immense, swept, formal plaza. Around it, the first mounds were rising platforms of packed earth destined to carry the homes of the powerful and the temples of the gods. Beyond them, in every direction, spread the neighborhoods, rows of rectangular thatched houses, courtyards, smaller plazas, the dwellings of the thousands of ordinary people whose hands and faith held the whole enormous project upright. And in the very center of it all, the ground was being prepared for the act that would come to define the city above all others, the raising, by hand and by basket, of an artificial mountain at the center of the world. How a people with no wheels, no draft animals, and no written plans built that mountain, and what they raised upon its summit is where the story turns next. To build a mountain by hand, a people must first agree that it matters. There were no wheels at Cahokia, no carts, no horses or oxen to bear a load. There were no iron tools to bite into the earth, no written plans to consult, no surveyor's instruments beyond cord and stake, and a deep, inherited understanding of the sky. There was only the ground itself, the baskets woven to carry it, and the will of thousands of people who had decided that the center of their world deserved a summit. And so, generation after generation, they made one. The thing they raised is known today by a name that has nothing to do with them. Monk's Mound takes its title from a small community of Trappist monks who farmed its terraces for a few years in the early 19th century, long after the city that built it had passed out of memory. The monks are gone. The mound remains. It rises from the floodplain in 4 broad terraces to a height of roughly 100 feet, and it covers an area at its base greater than that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is the largest earthen structure in the Americas, and one of the largest in the ancient world anywhere, and every cubic foot of it was carried there on the back of a human being. The estimates strain belief. The mound contains something on the order of 22 million cubic feet of earth by some calculations, more than 14 million baskets of soil, each one filled, hoisted, carried, and emptied by hand. The work was not done in a single heroic season. It unfolded across centuries, in stage after stage, as terraces were added, slumped sections were repaired, and the great platform was enlarged and reshaped by successive generations who inherited the project from their parents and passed it on to their children. A person might be born at the foot of the mound, labor upon it through an entire adult life, and die without ever seeing it finished because it was never, in any final sense, finished. It was always becoming. The builders understood their material with a sophistication that modern engineers have come to respect. They did not simply pile earth into a heap and hope it would hold. They selected their soils deliberately, drawing different earths from different borrow pits across the city, and they layered them with intention bands of dense, sticky clay alternating with looser, sandy fills. The clays shed water and gave the structure its skin. The sandy layers drained and relieved the pressure that would otherwise build inside so vast a mass after heavy rain. In places, the builders laid down what amounts to an internal drainage system, channels and permeable seams that carried water away before it could turn the mound's heart to slurry. They were managing forces that can destroy an earthen structure from within, and for the most part they managed them well, across 1,000 years of Mississippi weather. The terraces were not arbitrary. The lowest and largest spread out as broad working ground. Above them the mound stepped upward to a final summit, and there, on the highest terrace, stood a building unlike any other in the city, a great timber and thatch structure, perhaps 100 feet long, that archaeologists believe was the residence of Cahokia's paramount ruler, or a temple, or very likely both at once, in a society that drew no sharp line between earthly power and the sacred. From that height a single figure could look out across the entire metropolis, the swept plazas, the scores of lesser mounds, the thousands of rooftops, the fields stretching to the bluffs, the river beyond. No one else in North America stood so high or saw so much. The mound did not merely hold the ruler above the city. It declared, in raised earth, visible for miles, that the order of Cahokia ran from the soil to the sky, and that one house sat at the join. Monk's Mound was the greatest of them, but it was far from alone. At its height, the city bristled with mounds. More than 120 of them have been counted, and there were almost certainly others, ploughed flat or built over before anyone thought to record them. They came in distinct forms, and the forms carried meaning. The flat-topped platform mounds, like Monk's Mound itself, lifted the homes of the elite and the temples of the gods above the common ground. Conical and ridge-top mounds served the dead, marking burials and the passage of important people out of the living world. The mounds were arranged with care around the plazas, in deliberate relationships of height and alignment that an inhabitant would have read as fluently as a later citizen reads the spires and towers of a cathedral town. This was a built landscape that spoke of hierarchy, of cosmology, of who belonged where, and of what lay above the everyday. And around and between the mounds lay the city of the living. Tens of thousands of people made their homes at Cahokia in its prime, in numbers that would not be matched by any city north of Mexico until Philadelphia and New York swelled in the centuries after European colonization. They lived in rectangular houses with walls of upright posts set in trenches, the gaps woven with cane and plastered with mud, the roofs steep and thatched with prairie grass. The houses stood in orderly rows and clusters, opening onto small courtyards and neighborhood plazas, each district a community within the larger whole. There were granaries raised off the ground to keep the harvest dry, storage pits, work areas, and the constant low haze of cooking fires. A visitor coming down from the bluffs would have seen not a scatter of huts, but a true cityscape planned, dense, and humming with the life of a great population. In time, around the central precinct, the people raised a wall, a massive palisade of upright logs, thousands of them, was driven into the earth to enclose the heart of the city Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, and the most important buildings. It ran for some 3 kilometers, studded at intervals with bastions, projecting towers from which defenders could command the approaches. Building it consumed an estimated 20,000 mature trees, and the people did not build it once. They rebuilt it several times over the city's life, replacing the rotted timbers and, on occasion, raising it anew after fire. A wall on that scale is not the work of an idle society, and it is not built for ornament. It speaks of a city with something to protect and, increasingly, of a city with reason to be afraid, a thread the story will return to, for the palisade marks a turning, and its later rebuildings belong to darker years still ahead. For now, though, the city was rising, not falling, and to understand what the labor was for, the story has to leave the heights of the mounds and walk down into the plazas and the streets, into the ordinary, extraordinary business of a Mississippian day. At the center of it all lay the Grand Plaza, and it too was an act of engineering as deliberate as any mound. The ground there had once rolled and dipped, an uneven stretch of floodplain. The builders flattened it. They cut down the high points and filled the hollows, and laid a vast, level, open expanse at the heart of the city, some 50 acres of swept earth, roughly the size of 40 modern football fields, framed by Monk's Mound at one end and lesser mounds around its edges. It was the largest constructed open space in the ancient Americas north of the great cities of Mexico, and it was the stage on which the public life of Cahokia was performed. A morning in the city would have begun in the neighborhoods, in the grey light before the sun cleared the eastern bluffs. Cooking fires were coaxed back to life. The smell of wood smoke and roasting food drifted between the houses, and everywhere, in the work of preparing the day's meals and the year's stores, were the women of Cahokia, whose hands shaped the city as surely as the laborers who carried the baskets. It is easy, looking back at a society remembered chiefly for its mounds and its rulers, to overlook the people who fed it, but the archaeology will not allow it. The cuisine of Cahokia, the daily nourishment of a metropolis, was built on maize corn, and corn was the work of women. They tended the fields in the rich bottomland soils, they harvested and dried the crop, and above all they processed it, grinding the hard kernels into meal on stone, hour upon hour, in a labor without which the city simply could not have eaten. They also gathered and grew the other plants of the eastern agricultural complex: goosefoot, marsh elder, little barley, squash, and they tended the knowledge of which plants healed and which harmed. The pottery of Cahokia, some of the finest produced anywhere in ancient North America, came largely from their hands, thin-walled, well-fired vessels, some shaped and burnished with real artistry, made for cooking, for storage, and for the rituals of the table. The culture that the elite performed on the mountaintops rested, every single day, on the unsung expertise of the women in the houses below. The food itself tells of a settled, organized abundance, at least in the good years. Maize was the staple, eaten as porridge and bread and hominy. To it the people added the flesh of white-tailed deer above all, the single most important animal in the Cahokian diet, hunted across the surrounding country and brought back to the city in quantities that the rubbish of the place still records. There were fish from the river and the backwater lakes, waterfowl from the marshes, nuts from the upland forests, and the fruits of the bottomland in their season. And there was a drink that mattered more than mere refreshment: the black drink, a dark, caffeine-rich tea brewed from the leaves of a holly that grew far to the south, consumed in ritual from special beakers, used to purify and to focus before ceremony. That the holly does not grow anywhere near Cahokia is itself part of the story, because almost nothing about the city stayed within its own horizon. For Cahokia sat at the center of a web that reached across half a continent. The Mississippi and its great tributaries, the Missouri and the Ohio, met within easy reach of the city, and along those rivers, in canoes, moved the goods of a vast and various land. From the shores of Lake Superior came copper, hammered cold into sacred ornaments and emblems of rank. From the Gulf of Mexico, more than 1,000 kilometers to the south, came marine shell whelk and conch carried up the river systems to be worked into beads, pendants, and the great gorgets that the powerful wore at the throat. From the southern Appalachians came sheets of mica, thin and glittering, cut into ritual shapes. From the Great Plains came stone for tools, From distant quarries came the fine cherts that Cahokian artisans favored. Goods flowed in, and Cahokian things flowed out: its distinctive pottery, its ritual objects, and above all, its ideas, its style of building and worship, spreading along the rivers to inspire and overawe communities hundreds of kilometers away. This was not a market economy in any modern sense. Much of the exchange moved through the hands of the elite as gift and tribute, and the currency of alliance, binding distant peoples to the great city by ties of obligation and prestige. But trade on this scale had a texture that anyone would recognize. Strangers came to Cahokia. Canoes drew up at the landings bearing people who spoke other languages, wore other styles, carried news and goods from places most Cahokians would never see. A city of 20,000 at the hinge of a continent was a cosmopolitan place by the standards of its world, a place where the exotic arrived as a matter of course, and where the powerful displayed their reach by wearing the sea around their necks and the far northern metal upon their brows. And then there were the days when the city gathered and the grand plaza filled, and Cahokia showed itself what it was. The greatest of the public passions was a game. The Mississippians called it, in later descendants' tongues, chunky, and at Cahokia it was something close to a civic religion. The rules, as far as they can be reconstructed, were deceptively simple. A smooth, carefully ground stone disc, the chunky stone, a beautiful object in its own right, polished over countless hours and treasured for generations, was rolled across a prepared, flattened court. As it ran, players hurled long spears after it, not at the stone itself, but at the place where each judged the stone would come to rest. The thrower whose spear landed nearest the stopping disc won the cast. It sounds modest, described so plainly. It was anything but. Chunky gripped Cahokia. The Grand Plaza was, among its other functions, a vast chunky ground, and a great match could draw enormous crowds, thousands of people lining the open space, roaring with each roll and throw. Fortunes rode on the outcome. Spectators wagered everything they owned on the players, and the chronicles of later Mississippian peoples record men who, having staked and lost all their possessions on a game, were undone by it. The chunky stones themselves were objects of power, some so valued that they were buried with the dead or held as the property of whole communities. The game appears in Cahokian art, carved in stone, a player frozen mid-stride at the moment of the throw. It spread out from Cahokia along the same rivers that carried the city's other exports until it was played across much of the native South. More than entertainment, chunky was a way of channeling rivalry into ritual, of binding the watching thousands into a single excited body, of letting a diverse and crowded city feel, for an afternoon, like one people. But the gatherings that bound Cahokia most deeply were the feasts, and the scale of them is among the most astonishing things the archaeology has revealed. Beneath one of the mounds near the Grand Plaza, excavators found the buried remains of communal feasting on a scale that defies the imagination. In great pits lay the residue of single events at which the city consumed staggering quantities of food, at once the butchered bones of thousands of deer, brought down and shared in a few days. The bones of swans and other birds prized for ceremony rather than mere sustenance. The broken sherds of vast numbers of pots, many of them apparently made for the occasion and discarded after. And, packed through the deposits, the residue of tobacco and other plants burned and consumed in ritual. These were not ordinary meals. They were instruments of statecraft and faith. To feed thousands of people at a single sitting, a society must command surpluses, organize labor, and project the kind of generous, overwhelming power that turns a crowd of strangers into followers. The great feasts of Cahokia drew people in from the surrounding country and perhaps from much further afield, fed them to abundance, drew them into shared ritual, and sent them home bound to the city by memory and obligation. The remains record the same lesson the founding generation seems to have known, that a city is held together not only by walls and fields and the muscle of its builders, but by belief, by spectacle, and by the bonds that great gatherings forge. The black drink was brewed and taken, the pipes were lit, the deer were roasted by the thousand. And for a few days the floodplain at the center of the world became the scene of something very like a festival of an entire civilization. The goods that flowed in along the rivers did not stay raw for long, because Cahokia was also a city of makers. In the houses and work areas, in dedicated quarters of the great settlement, the people practiced crafts at a level of skill and, in some cases, a scale of production that hinted something like specialization at artisans who did one thing supremely well, and who may have done it for others rather than only for themselves. The clearest case is the working of shell. The marine shell carried up from the distant Gulf was transformed at Cahokia into beads in quantities that are difficult to grasp. The single burial that the story will shortly turn to contained, by itself, tens of thousands of shell beads, arranged in the form of a great bird beneath a human body, and those tens of thousands represent only what was committed to a single grave on a single occasion. To produce beads in such numbers, by hand, by drilling and grinding each one from a fragment of imported shell, implies workshops, practiced hands, and an organization of labor devoted to the manufacture of objects whose value lay entirely in ritual and rank. Whole lives at Cahokia may have been spent turning the sea, piece by piece, into the currency of the sacred. Other crafts reached the level of true art, from the fine, workable flint clay of a quarry to the south. Cahokian sculptors carved small figures of astonishing accomplishment, among them the figurine known to archaeologists as the Burger figurine, a kneeling woman working the back of a feline-headed serpent with a hoe, vines heavy with gourds curling up over her shoulder. It is an image dense with meaning, the earth, fertility, the cultivated plant, the female power that fed the city, fused with the supernatural creatures of the Mississippian cosmos. These figurines were not idle ornaments. They were religious objects, expressions of a whole theology of soil and growth and renewal, made by people who could render that theology in stone with a sculptor's eye. Cahokia produced not only food and earthworks, but ideas given form, and those forms, carried outward along the rivers, helped spread Cahokian belief across the wider Mississippian world. There was, too, the humbler but essential industry of stone and salt and timber. Cahokian knappers worked the fine cherts into hoes, knives, and the long ceremonial blades that the elite prized. Some of these tools were so well made and so widely distributed that they appear to have been produced for exchange far beyond the city. Salt was drawn from saline springs in the surrounding region, evaporated in coarse pans, and traded as a necessity of life. And timber, the great appetite of the city, was felled in quantity from the surrounding forests for the houses, the palisade, the Woodhenge posts, and the endless fires. A metropolis of 20,000 consumes wood at a rate that reshapes the land around it, and the demands of Cahokia pressed steadily outward into the woodlands of the bluffs and the bottom, a pressure whose long-term consequences would later become part of the argument over why the city fell. The people who did all this work were not, it turns out, a single people at all. One of the most striking discoveries about Cahokia is how many of its inhabitants came from somewhere else. The chemistry of human teeth and bone records the water and food of childhood, and the isotopes locked into the remains of Cahokians tell of a population drawn from across a wide region of men and women who had grown up far away and migrated to the great city, whether as pilgrims drawn by its religion, as laborers drawn by its projects, or as whole communities resettled into its orbit. Differences in pottery styles and house forms across the city's neighborhoods point the same way. Distinct groups with distinct traditions, living side by side beneath the shadow of the mounds. This changes the picture of the place profoundly. Cahokia was not a city that simply grew from the villages around it. It was, in large part, a city that gathered a center that pulled people in from a great distance and, somehow, forged them into one community, with shared plazas, shared games, shared feasts, and a shared devotion to the order embodied in the mounds. That is a far harder thing to do than to build a mound. To take strangers of different tongues and traditions and bind them into a single urban people, held together without writing, without coinage, without any of the bureaucratic machinery that later cities would lean on, was an achievement of religion and spectacle and sheer social genius. The feasts and the games and the great ceremonies were not decoration upon the city. They were, quite literally, the thing that made the city possible. Holding such a gathering together also demanded a constant, invisible labor of provisioning that ran beneath every grand occasion. The fields of the American bottom had to feed the multitude, and the bottomland soils, rich and renewed by the river, were among the best maize-growing ground on the continent. Out beyond the built-up districts, the cultivated land stretched away, worked through the warm months, the harvest gathered into the raised granaries against the lean season. The river and its backwater lakes had to be fished, the marshes hunted for waterfowl, the forests worked for deer and nuts and timber. The canoes had to come and go at the landings, bearing the exotic goods of the elite and the bulk staples of ordinary life. A city is a mouth as much as a monument, and Cahokia's mouth was enormous. For a century and more, the land and the labor kept pace with it, the climate generous, the floods held off, the harvests sufficient to feed both the daily population and the great gatherings that periodically swelled it. That balance between a vast, hungry city and the country that sustained it was the quiet condition of everything else, and that balance, in time, would not hold. There is a temptation, surveying all this, the mountain of earth, the planned plazas, the continental trade, the roaring crowds, the colossal feasts, to imagine Cahokia as a kind of paradise, a golden age in the heartland of the continent. It was not. It was a human city, with all that implies. It had its hierarchies, steep and real, that lifted a few onto the mound tops and kept the many in the houses below. It had its labor, ceaseless and hard, the bent backs and ground stone and carried baskets that the spectacle was built upon. And it had, woven through its grandeur, a darker strand, for the same power that could raise a mountain and feed a multitude could also, when it chose, command the ending of human lives and stage that ending as part of the sacred order. What the diggers found beneath one unremarkable ridge of earth, a place now known only by a number, would reveal the price that Cahokia's order could exact, but that reckoning, and the cosmos of sun and sky that framed it is where the story turns next. To understand why a people would carry a mountain into the sky one basket at a time, and why, beneath a single low ridge of earth, they would lay the bodies of the young and the strong as carefully as they laid the shell beads of a sacred bird, the story has to leave the plazas and the workshops and rise into the realm the Cahokians themselves believed governed all of it. The mounds were not engineering for its own sake. The plaza was not merely a marketplace. They were the working parts of a cosmos, and that cosmos has to be understood on its own terms before the darkest thing the diggers found can be read for what it was. The Mississippian universe was built in layers. Above lay the sky world, the realm of order and light, of the sun and the moon, and the great powers that moved among the stars. Below lay the underworld, a place of water and chaos and fertility, of serpents and the creatures of the deep, dangerous and life-giving at once. And between the two, balanced on the surface of the waters, lay this world, the middle place, the thin inhabited skin where human beings lived out their days between the powers above and the powers below. The whole of Cahokian religion can be read as an effort to keep those worlds in their proper relation, to draw down the order of the sky, to hold back the chaos of the deep, and to keep the fragile middle world from tipping into either. It was a cosmos held together by tension rather than peace. The powers above and the powers below were locked in a perpetual opposition, and the role of human beings, above all the role of priests and rulers, was to stand in the balance point and keep the two from collapsing into one another. This is why so much of Mississippian sacred art turns on pairings and oppositions. The falcon of the upper air set against the horned serpent of the deep water, the eye and the cross and the circle repeated on shell and copper, the constant marking of center and edge, of up and down, of the four directions meeting at a single point. To the people who lived beneath the mounds, the design of their city was not decoration. It was a working diagram of reality, and tending it correctly was a matter, quite literally, of holding the world together. At the center of the world above stood the sun. The Mississippians were, in the fullest sense, a people of the sun. They watched it, charted it, built for it, and tied the authority of their rulers to it. The Lord who lived atop Monk's Mound did not simply govern by force or wealth. He was understood to stand in a special relation to the sky, a living link between the people and the powers that brought the maize up out of the ground each spring and ripened it each autumn. To raise his house higher than any other roof in North America was to place him nearer the sky he served, and to make that nearness visible to every soul in the valley. Tied to the sun was fire, its earthly echo, a sacred fire, kept burning and ritually renewed, seems to have stood at the heart of Mississippian religious life, a living ember of the sun brought down into the middle world, tended in the temples atop the mounds, and carried, in later centuries, among the peoples who inherited this tradition as the very soul of a community. To let the sacred fire die was to let the world go dark. And so the Cahokians did something that, more than almost anything else they left behind, reveals the seriousness of their attention to the sky. West of the Great Mound, out on the level ground, they raised a circle of posts. The structure is known today as Woodhenge, a name borrowed, half in jest and half in earnest, from the great stone circle on Salisbury Plain an ocean away. The comparison is not idle. Like its English namesake, Cahokia's Woodhenge was an instrument for reading the year in the movements of the sun. The Cahokians cut tall, straight posts of red cedar, a wood they held sacred, prized for its color and its resistance to rot, and set them upright in a great ring, evenly spaced around a wide circle, with a single observation post offset near the center. From that central post, on the right mornings, a watcher could mark exactly where along the eastern horizon the sun would break. The genius of the thing lay in the alignments. On the morning of the spring and autumn equinoxes, the rising sun came up in line with a particular post on the eastern arc of the circle, and it rose, as seen from the center, directly out of the front of Monk's Mound itself, as though the great earthen mountain were giving birth to the sun. On the solstices, the longest and shortest days, the sunrise aligned with other posts, marking the turning points of the year. The circle was a calendar, written in cedar and sunlight, and it was almost certainly more than that. To stand at the center and watch the sun emerge from the Lord's own mound on the day the seasons balanced was to witness, in light, the very claim the whole city was built to make, that the order of the sky and the order of Cahokia were one thing, and that the man on the mound stood at the join. The rebuilding of the circle over time, in slightly different forms, suggests a society refining its observations, keeping its calendar true across the generations. Whoever kept the Woodhenge kept the year and the ceremonies, the plantings, and the great gatherings that the year was hung upon. That calendar governed more than the harvest. It governed the games. Out on the Grand Plaza, before crowds that may have numbered in the thousands, the Cahokians played Chunky, a contest in which a polished stone disc was rolled across the packed earth, while players hurled long spears at the spot where they judged it would stop. It looks, at a distance, like sport, and in part it was, but Chunky was woven deep into the sacred order. The stones themselves were precious, handed down across generations and buried with great lords. The falcon being of the upper world is sometimes shown clutching one. The game seems to have carried meanings of fate and divination and the trial of warriors, a way of reading the will of the powers in the roll of a stone and the flight of a spear. To gather a multitude on the plaza beneath the great mound and play out that contest was to perform the cosmos in miniature, to make the watching crowd participants in the order the priests above them tended. The spread of Chunky out from Cahokia, like the spread of so much else, traces the spread of a whole way of seeing the world. The being who presided over this sun-ordered world appears again and again in the art the Mississippians left behind, and once recognized, he is unmistakable. He is part man and part falcon, a human figure with the wings, the eye markings, and the fierce hooked profile of a raptor, often shown in motion, dancing or in flight, sometimes grasping a severed head or a ceremonial mace. Archaeologists call him the Birdman, and he was among the central figures of the Mississippian sky. The falcon swift, high-flying, deadly, a creature of the upper air, was a natural emblem of the sky world and of the warrior power that descended from it. To wear the Birdman, carved into a shell gorget at the throat or hammered into a sheet of sacred copper, was to claim a share of that power, to declare oneself aligned with the order above, with the sun and the falcon, and the right to rule that came down from them. The Birdman did not stay at Cahokia. Over the generations that followed the city's rise, his image and the whole web of symbols that traveled with him, the cross in circle that marked the sacred fire and the four directions, the weeping eye, the mace and the severed head, the horned serpent of the deep spread across an enormous reach of the continent. Archaeologists have given this shared body of sacred art a name, the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. sometimes called the Southern Cult. From the Mississippi Valley it carried east to Georgia, south toward the Gulf, and out across the woodlands, a common visual language of power and the sacred shared by peoples who spoke different tongues and answered to different lords. At the source of much of it, at the place where the Falcon Man first danced at this scale, stood Cahokia. The city did not merely grow large, it exported a religion, and the symbols of that religion outlived the city that sent them out into the world by centuries. All of this, the layered cosmos, the sun watching, the Falcon Lord, the symbols carried across half a continent, was a structure of belief, invisible in itself, knowable now only through the things it left in the ground. And then, beneath one unremarkable ridge of earth toward the southern edge of the city, archaeologists found the place where that belief had been written, once, in human bodies. They gave the ridge a number, because its old name was long gone. They called it Mound 72. What they uncovered there is among the most extraordinary and the most sobering discoveries in the archaeology of North America. At the heart of it lay a single man. He had died, it seems, in his early 40s, and he had been laid to rest with a care and a richness that mark him as one of the most important people in the history of the city. Beneath his body, the mourners had spread a great blanket of marine shell beads, somewhere on the order of 20,000 of them, each one carried up from the distant Gulf, each one drilled and ground by hand, and they had arranged that vast field of shell into a shape. The beads formed the figure of a bird, a falcon, its body beneath the man and its wings spread beneath his arms, so that he lay upon the Birdman, or as the Birdman, joined in death to the very being of the sky that the living rulers had claimed to embody. A second body lay above the bead bird, face down, the two figures sandwiching the sacred shell between them. Around them the mourners had heaped offerings, caches of finely worked arrowheads in the styles of distant regions, rolls of sheet copper, mica from the eastern mountains, and chunky stones, the treasured discs of the great game. Here, gathered into a single grave, was the reach of half a continent, laid down in honor of one man. But the beaded burial was not alone beneath Mound 72, and the graves that surrounded it tell a far darker story. Mound 72 was not built in a single act. It rose in stages, over a span of years, as a series of separate burial episodes were gathered together beneath one growing ridge of earth, and across those episodes, archaeologists found the remains of more than 250 people. Many of them had not died of natural causes. In one pit lay the bodies of more than 50 young women, all of roughly the same age, arranged in neat, orderly rows in layers, with a care that makes the scene more disturbing rather than less. They show no obvious signs of violence, which has led many researchers to believe they were killed by means that left no mark on the bone and that they were killed together, as part of a single ceremony to accompany the dead into the world beyond, or to consecrate the place, or to demonstrate, in the most absolute terms imaginable, the power of those who could command such a thing. In another pit lay a group of men who had met a far more violent end. Some had been decapitated, some bore the marks of clubbing, and a number appear to have been buried before they were fully dead, their fingers, in a few cases, still clawed into the sand beneath them. Elsewhere in the mound lay 4 men laid out together, with their heads and their hands removed, a deliberate, ritual mutilation whose meaning is lost, but whose care and repetition mark it, again, as ceremony rather than mere violence. It is important to hold these findings carefully, and without the appetite for horror that they can so easily invite. The people of Mound 72 were not killed at random, nor casually. Everything about the site, the orderly rows, the rich central burial, the deliberate caches, the staged repetition of the killings across what seemed to have been several separate events over time, speaks of ritual, of a religious and political logic that made these deaths, in the eyes of those who carried them out, necessary and meaningful. The sacrifices were almost certainly tied to the cosmology, to the death and renewal of rulers, to the maintenance of the ordered world, to the relationship between the powers above and the city below. Many societies across the ancient world, on every inhabited continent, practiced human sacrifice at moments of supreme religious weight, and the Mississippians were no exception. To recoil from it is human. To understand it requires setting the recoil aside long enough to see what those who dug the pits believed they were doing. What Mound 72 reveals, beyond the particulars, is the sheer reach of the power that ran through Cahokia at its height. The same authority that could summon thousands to carry a mountain of earth, that could feed a multitude at a single feast, that could pull strangers from across the mid-continent and forge them into one people. That authority could also, when the order of the cosmos seemed to require it, command the ending of human lives, and stage that ending as a sacred act witnessed by the city. The mound that held the Falcon Lord on his bed of 20,000 shells was, at the same time, the mound that held the sacrificed in their silent rows. Grandeur and dread were not opposites at Cahokia. They were the two faces of a single power, and the people who lived beneath the mounds understood both. The religious gravity of the city did not end at its own boundaries. It reached outward, across the bottomland and up into the surrounding uplands, drawing the wider region into Cahokia's sacred orbit, and the clearest sign of that reach lies some 24 kilometers to the east, on a low rise above a creek, at a site that archaeologists have come to call the Emerald Acropolis. The Emerald site was not a city. It was a shrine, a great ceremonial complex, raised on a natural ridge that the Cahokians reshaped and enlarged into a deliberate platform, crowned with mounds and ringed with the remains of buildings that appear to have been used briefly, intensely, and then renewed. It sat at the far end of a broad, straight pathway, a ceremonial road that ran for kilometers across the landscape toward Cahokia, so that the shrine and the great city were tied together by a deliberate line drawn over the earth. People came to Emerald not to live but to gather, to make a journey, to perform rites, and to depart. The buildings there were not lived in for years on end. They were razed, used in a burst of ceremony, and then taken down or burned and built again. The rhythm of a place visited in pulses rather than inhabited. It bears all the marks of a pilgrimage center, a place set apart from ordinary life and visited at appointed times by people drawn from across the region. And the appointed times appear to have been written, like so much else at Cahokia, in the sky, but here it was, not the sun that governed, but the moon. The buildings and mounds of the Emerald site were aligned not to the simple, yearly rhythm of the solstices, but to a far stranger and more demanding cycle, the slow, 18.5-year oscillation of the moon's rising and setting points along the horizon, the cycle that astronomers call the lunar standstill. It is a rhythm that cannot be grasped in a single season or even a single decade. To build for it, a people must keep watch across a generation, recording where the moon rises at its extremes, passing that knowledge down until the pattern reveals itself. The Cahokians, or the priests among them, had done exactly that. They had read the longest visible rhythm in the night sky, and they had built a pilgrimage shrine to honor it, and they had laid a road to bind that lunar shrine to their sun-ordered capital. The timing matters, because the Emerald Shrine and the great surge that built Cahokia appeared to belong to the same moment. The city did not rise slowly and steadily. It rose in a rush, in a transformation so sudden that archaeologists have borrowed a phrase from cosmology and called it Cahokia's Big Bang, a generation in which the population swelled. The great mounds went up, and the whole sacred landscape was laid out, as if to a single plan. The pilgrimage roads, the aligned shrines, the gathering of strangers from far away, the reading of sun and moon into the design of the land, all of it speaks of a religious movement of real force. Something powerful enough to pull people across hundreds of kilometers and bind them, for a time, into the largest community north of Mexico. The Emerald Acropolis suggests, in the end, that Cahokia was something stranger and grander than a chiefdom that simply grew too big. It was the center of a faith with the power to draw pilgrims across the land, to organize the landscape itself into sacred lines and aligned shrines, and to read both the sun and the moon into a single vast scheme. The migrants whose bones record childhoods in distant places may have come, many of them, not as conscripts or refugees but as pilgrims, pulled toward the great city, the way the faithful of other ages have been pulled toward their holy places. A city that gathers strangers and binds them without writing or coinage needs something powerful at its core to do the binding. At Cahokia, that something was a religion of the sky and the deep, of sun and moon and falcon and serpent, staged in earth and timber, and, at its most extreme, in blood. For a century and more, that religion held. The mounds rose, the feasts roared, the pilgrims came down the road from Emerald, the sun climbed each equinox out of the Lord's own mountain, and the order of the cosmos seemed secure. But no order holds forever, and the same sky the Cahokians watched so closely was, even then, beginning to turn against them. The generous, flood-free climate that had let the great city be born would not last. The rains would change, the river would rise, and the delicate balance between a vast, hungry capital and the country that fed it would begin, slowly, and then not so slowly, to fail. And out beyond the bottomland, beyond Emerald and the satellite towns that clustered in Cahokia's shadow, the wider Mississippian world that the great city had called into being would have its own part to play in what came next. That unraveling and the long, strange afterlife in which Cahokia was not merely abandoned but actively erased is where the story turns now. To see Cahokia whole, the eye has to lift from Monk's Mound and the Grand Plaza and take in the entire floodplain, because the great city was never a single cluster of earthworks around a single square. It was a sprawling thing, spread across the bottomland in 3 great precincts, joined by the low country between them into one continuous urban world. The mounds at the foot of the bluffs gathered around the Lord's mountain were only the heart of it. To the southwest, across the floodplain, stood a second great node of mounds and plazas, large enough in its own right to have been a major center anywhere else in the ancient mid-continent. And further still, on the western edge of the bottom where a later city of brick and iron would one day rise, stood a third. Together, they formed a metropolis that stretched for miles, 3 beating centers of one immense community laid out across the richest farmland in the interior of the continent. The second of those precincts, the one archaeologists would later find buried beneath the rail yards and industry of a modern river town, was no mere suburb. It held its own dense field of mounds, scores of them raised around plazas of its own, and beneath the ground there lay the traces of a vast and crowded settlement, thousands of buildings, rebuilt again and again, packed close along the bottomland. The excavations there, carried out in haste before highways and bridges sealed the ground over for good, turned up something striking. A great compound of buildings, raised with care and filled with goods, that had been deliberately burned. Hundreds of structures went up in flame in what seems to have been a single planned event. The buildings emptied of people first and then given to the fire, the way an offering is given. Whether it marked a moment of crisis, or a ritual closing of one chapter of the city's life, or some convulsion in its politics, no one can now say with certainty, but it speaks to a city capable of grand and deliberate gestures, of building on an enormous scale and then, when some logic demanded it, of unbuilding on the same scale. The third precinct, on the far western edge of the floodplain, is the hardest to recover because almost nothing of it survives. It once held its own group of mounds, tall earthworks rising above the river, a small city of the dead and the sacred in their own right. But that ground became the foundation of a modern city, and in the 18th and 19th centuries the mounds were leveled one by one, carted away for fill, flattened for streets and warehouses and rail. The greatest of them, a broad earthwork that had stood for 7 centuries, was demolished within a single generation of settlers, its soil hauled off to raise the grade of the growing town. By the time anyone thought to record what had been lost, it was already gone. That precinct is a kind of warning set early in the story, a sign of how completely the works of Cahokia could be erased, and how casually, by people who did not know or did not care what they were destroying. The full reckoning of that erasure comes later, but the western mounds were among its first victims. Taken together, the 3 precincts and the dense countryside between and around them made Cahokia not just a ceremonial center, but a true city, with all the messiness and concentration that the word implies. People lived shoulder to shoulder in their thousands, in neighborhoods that pressed close around the plazas, drawing their water and their fuel and their food from a landscape that had to be worked harder, year on year, to keep so many fed and warm. A city of that size is a remarkable achievement. It is also, by its nature, a fragile one, dependent on a steady flow of grain and timber and goodwill, and vulnerable in ways that a scattered village can never be. The very thing that made Cahokia magnificent, its concentration, its scale, the sheer number of people it had gathered into one place, was also the thing that would make its unmaking so complete. How many people that was remains one of the hardest questions in the whole story, and the estimates have swung widely across the generations of scholars who have wrestled with it. The most careful reckonings place the population of the central precinct alone at its height, somewhere in the range of 10 to 15,000 souls, with thousands more spread through the second and third precincts and the farmsteads scattered across the bottomland between. By any measure, it was the largest gathering of people anywhere north of the great cities of Mexico, a population that would not be matched within the bounds of what later became the United States until the closing years of the 18th century, when a young Philadelphia finally grew large enough to rival a city that had risen and fallen and been forgotten centuries before. To stand in the Grand Plaza at midsummer, amid the smoke of 10,000 cooking fires, with the great mound rising against the sky and the lesser mounds stretching away in their hundreds across the floodplain, was to stand at the center of a world. And it was a world built, to a striking degree, on purpose. The neighborhoods of Cahokia were not the haphazard sprawl of a settlement that had simply grown. Large parts of the city show signs of planning, of houses laid out in orderly rows around courtyards, of whole districts raised in single coordinated efforts, of a central axis aligned to the cardinal directions that ran like a spine through the sacred heart of the place. The people who poured into the city in its founding generation came, the evidence increasingly suggests, from far and wide, the chemistry of teeth and bone hinting at men and women who had grown up in distant country and migrated to the great center in the years of its rise, drawn by whatever combination of opportunity, faith, and compulsion brings people to a capital. Cahokia was, in that sense, a city of immigrants, a place that had gathered diverse peoples from across the mid-continent and bound them into a single new society beneath the mounds. Such a population could not feed itself from the floodplain alone. Beyond the bottomland, up in the rolling uplands east of the city, lay a dense scatter of farming villages and hamlets whose entire purpose seems to have been to grow the maize that fed the capital. These were the engine rooms of Cahokia, ordinary families working the upland soils season after season, raising more grain than they could ever eat and sending the surplus down to the great city. The relationship between the splendid center and its working hinterland was the quiet foundation on which everything else stood. The mounds, the feasts, the falcon lords. The whole towering edifice of Cahokian civilization rested, in the end, on the willingness and the ability of farming families in the hills to keep producing more than they needed. It is a dependence worth holding in mind, because when the climate turned, it was precisely this relationship, invisible, unglamorous, and utterly essential, that would come under the greatest strain. The Cahokians read the seasons that governed their planting with remarkable precision, and they built an instrument to do it. On the western edge of the city, archaeologists uncovered the post holes of a great circle of upright timbers, a ring of tall red cedar posts, set in a precise arrangement, with a single observation post at its center. Standing at that center, on the morning of an equinox or a solstice, and watching the sun rise along the line of a particular post, an observer could mark the turning points of the year with an accuracy that mattered enormously to a people whose survival depended on planting at the right moment. The structure, sometimes called a woodhenge, was rebuilt several times, growing larger with each version, and on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the sun would appear to rise directly out of the great mound itself, as though the Lord's mountain were giving birth to the day. Here was a society that had married practical astronomy to sacred drama, that timed its fields by the same instrument with which it staged the order of the cosmos. Before that unmaking, though, the city's influence ran far beyond the floodplain it occupied. Cahokia sat at the center of a web that stretched across half a continent, and what traveled along the strands of that web was not only copper and shell and stone, but ideas, a whole way of ordering the world. In the generations after Cahokia's sudden rise, the marks of its civilization began to appear at sites hundreds of kilometers away. The platform mounds arranged around open plazas, the reliance on maize, the imagery of the falcon warrior and the horned serpent worked into shell and copper, the rituals of the chunky game and the sacred fire. Some of this spread by trade, some by the movement of people, some perhaps by deliberate missions carrying the new religion outward from its source. Whatever the mechanism, the century of Cahokia's greatness was also the century in which the Mississippian world took shape across the river valleys of the mid-continent and the southeast, a constellation of mound-building societies sharing a common vocabulary of belief. The reach of that world can be read directly in the things the Cahokians left behind, because the raw materials of their finest objects came from astonishing distances. Marine shell whelk and conch from the warm waters of the Gulf Coast, far to the south, arrived in quantity to be carved into beads and cut into the gorgets that the elite wore at their throats. Copper, hammered cold into sheets and ornaments, came up from the deposits around the Great Lakes to the north. Mica with its bright mirror sheen was carried from the southern mountains. Galena, the heavy lead ore prized for the glittering powder it yielded, came from sources scattered across the mid-continent. Fine stone for tools and the polished discs of the chunky game traveled hundreds of kilometers from quarry to plaza, and the traffic ran outward as well as in. The distinctive hoes chipped from a pale, hard flint found near the city were traded far beyond it. The iconic falcon and serpent imagery spread along the same routes, and Cahokian-style pottery and figurines turned up at sites 1,000 kilometers distant. Goods, images, and ideas all moved along the great rivers that braided the interior of the continent, and Cahokia sat at the hub where those currents met. It would be too simple to say that Cahokia ruled them, for there is little sign that the great city governed distant places in any direct way. No evidence of an empire holding territory by force across the interior. What Cahokia exerted was something subtler and in its way more lasting, the pull of a center, the prestige of the place where the great mounds stood and the falcon lords were buried, the gravity of a holy city upon a wide and watching world. Pilgrims came to it, goods flowed to it. Its styles and its gods were copied far from its plazas. And when, in time, the great city on the bottomland began to falter, the wider world it had helped bring into being did not falter with it. Other centers to the south and east, in the river country of what would later be called Alabama and Georgia and Oklahoma, would rise and flourish for centuries more, carrying the Mississippian way forward long after its first and greatest expression had emptied out. Cahokia lit the fire. The fire would outlive the hearth. But within the great city itself, even at the height of its reach, something had begun to change, and the clearest sign of it was a wall. For most of Cahokia's life, the central precinct had stood open, the grand plaza spread wide and welcoming, the mounds rising unguarded above it, a sacred landscape made to gather people in rather than keep them out. And then, roughly a century and a half after the great surge that built the city, the people of Cahokia raised a stockade, a massive timber palisade, 2 miles in length, enclosing Monk's Mound and the Grand Plaza and the sacred heart of the city behind a wall of upright logs studded with projecting bastions, the kind of fortified towers from which defenders could shoot down along the face of the wall. It was an enormous undertaking. Each version of the palisade swallowed something on the order of 20,000 logs, whole stands of timber felled and hauled and set into the ground, and the wall was not built once, but raised, dismantled, and rebuilt 3 or 4 times across the generations that followed, each rebuilding consuming another forest's worth of wood. A wall like that is a confession. A city that has lived for a century with open plazas does not suddenly wrap its sacred core in a fortified stockade unless something has changed in how its people feel about the world beyond and about one another. The palisade speaks of insecurity where there had once been confidence, of a need to separate the sacred precinct and its rulers from the press of the population, or to defend it against enemies whose identity is now lost. Whether the threat came from outside rival peoples drawn by Cahokia's wealth, or unsettled by its power, or from within, in the strains and factions of a crowded and unequal city, the records in the earth cannot fully say, but the meaning of the wall is plain enough. The city that had drawn strangers in from across the continent and bound them together in a single great community had begun, by its second century, to feel the need to guard its heart. The confidence of the founding generations had given way to something more anxious. And there was a deeper pressure at work, slower than any human quarrel and far harder to fight. The land itself and the sky above it were turning. Cahokia had been born in a fortunate moment. The centuries of its rise fell within a long span of relatively warm, stable, generous climate, when the rains came reliably and the great river kept, for the most part, to its channel, leaving the rich bottomland fields free to be planted and harvested season after season. That stability was not a permanent gift. It was a window, and the window was closing. As the 13th century wore on, the climate of the mid-continent grew harsher and less predictable. Episodes of drought, stretching across years, the dependable rhythm of the growing season fraying into uncertainty. For a city that fed tens of thousands of people from the maize grown in its surrounding fields, a run of dry years was not an inconvenience. It was a slow emergency, a widening gap between the mouths to be fed and the grain the land could give. Drought was only half of it. The same studies of old sediments and ancient flood deposits that revealed the calm of Cahokia's early centuries revealed something else for the years of its decline: the return of the river. For generations the Mississippi had spared the bottomland the worst of its floods, and that reprieve had been one of the quiet conditions of the city's existence, allowing the floodplain to be farmed intensively and lived upon in enormous numbers. Then, around the turn of the 13th century, the great floods came back. Layers of flood-laid silt record the river rising again over the very ground the Cahokians depended on, drowning fields, ruining stored harvests, threatening the low-lying neighborhoods where so much of the population lived. A city perched on a floodplain had gambled, in effect, on the river's restraint, and across the years of its decline that gamble began to fail. The water that had made the bottomland so rich became, once more, a danger. Some of that danger, one influential line of argument holds, the city may have brought upon itself. A settlement of tens of thousands of people, raising mile upon mile of timber palisade and rebuilding it again and again, roofing thousands of houses, and burning wood for warmth and cooking through every winter, makes enormous demands upon the forests around it. By this reading, the Cahokians steadily stripped the wooded uplands of their timber, and a hillside cleared of trees holds water poorly. Rain that once soaked slowly into a forested slope instead runs off in sudden sheets, swelling the local creeks into flash floods that scour the bottomland fields below. The great city, in other words, may have undermined its own foundations, its appetite for wood translating across the generations into eroded hills and ruined harvests close to home, a slow ecological debt coming due. It is worth saying that this picture has been challenged later. Studies of the local flood deposits have questioned how neatly the timing fits, and some researchers see the river's own moods, rather than human mismanagement, as the heavier hand. The honest answer is that the debate is not settled, and that the truth very likely lies in the tangle where human choices and a shifting climate fed upon one another. But the shape of the predicament is clear enough: a vast, hungry city, a forest that could not be replaced as fast as it was felled, and a landscape growing less forgiving in the very century when forgiveness was most needed. It is tempting to look for a single catastrophe in the fall of a great city, a war, a plague, a sudden disaster that brings everything down at once. Cahokia offers no such clean ending. What the evidence describes instead is an unravelling, gradual, cumulative, spread across more than a century. The droughts and the floods did not destroy the city in a season. They wore at the foundations of the bargain that held it together. A capital of that size depended on a steady surplus of food, on the willingness of farmers in the surrounding country to grow more than they needed and bring it in, and on the people's faith that the rulers and priests on the mounds could keep the world in order. Lean years strained the surplus, failed harvests strained the faith, and a religion built on the promise that the proper tending of the cosmos would keep the rains gentle and the river kind had no good answer when the rains failed and the river rose anyway. So the people began, quietly and over generations, to leave. There was no single exodus, no day on which Cahokia emptied. There was instead a long ebbing families, and then whole neighborhoods drifting away from the crowded bottomland back to smaller communities, out to the wider Mississippian world, where life was less precarious and the demands of the great mounds did not weigh so heavily. The population that had swelled so suddenly in the city's Big Bang began, just as steadily, to fall. The grand construction slowed and then stopped. The great feasts grew rarer. The neighborhoods thinned. By the middle of the 14th century, the largest city north of Mexico stood all but empty, its mounds still rising above the floodplain, its plazas silent, its houses fallen in and grassed over, the falcon lords in their graves, and no one left to tend the fires. What is most haunting about Cahokia's end is how complete and how quiet it was. The people did not vanish. They dispersed, carrying their descendants and their memories out into the nations of the river country and the plains and the southeast, where the threads of Mississippian life would continue in new forms for centuries. But the city itself was simply let go, abandoned to the grass and the seasons, until the mounds that had taken generations to raise stood unexplained above an empty land. And it is here, in that silence, that the strangest part of the story begins: not the fall of the city, but its erasure. The long centuries in which the greatest earthworks on the continent would stand in plain sight and be denied, explained away, and almost entirely forgotten, until the descendants of those who built them and the slow work of the spade began at last to restore the truth. That is where the story turns next. The land did not stay empty because the people had died. That is the first thing to set right. The men and women who had raised the mounds, who had played chunky in the great plaza and carried baskets of earth up the flank of the largest pyramid on the continent, did not vanish from the world. They walked out of it. They carried their children, their stories, their songs, and their seed corn into the wider country, and they went on living. The city ended. The people did not. Where they went is written, faintly, in the languages and the memories of the nations who came after. The peoples of the Degiha, the Osage, the Omaha, the Ponca, the Kaw, the Quapaw carried oral traditions of a migration down great rivers, of a time when their ancestors had lived together before parting and moving to the lands where Europeans would later find them. Their languages, their clan systems, their relationship to the sky and the earth and the sacred bundle all carry the deep grammar of the Mississippian world. Other nations across the southeast and the plains carried fragments of the same inheritance. The falcon being on the copper plates, the cross in circle of the four directions, the reverence for the sun and the ordered cosmos, these did not die at Cahokia. They scattered and they survived, woven into ceremonies that are still kept today. But the Central Valley itself, the American bottom, that had held the largest community north of Mexico, fell quiet. Archaeologists call the wider region, in the centuries after the great centers declined, the vacant quarter, a stretch of the middle Mississippi that emptied of towns and was left to the grass and the deer and the slow work of the river. When the first Europeans pushed into the interior, they were too late by centuries to see Cahokia as a living place. Further south, Hernando de Soto's expedition in the 1540s still passed through Mississippian chiefdoms with their temple mounds and their paramount lords. The world that built Cahokia had not entirely ended elsewhere, but the great city on the Mississippi was already long abandoned, its mounds already old, its name already lost. The very word Cahokia is borrowed the name of a much later tribe who lived in the area when the French arrived and who had nothing to do with building the place. We do not know what its makers called it. That, too, is part of what was lost. And so the people who eventually settled the American bottom, in large numbers French traders, and then American farmers and townsfolk in the 17 and 1800s arrived to find something they could not explain. Rising out of the flat floodplain stood enormous earthen hills, geometric, deliberate, plainly made by human hands. Around St. Louis there were dozens of them, so many that the growing settlement earned a nickname, Mound City. Across the river, the great flat-topped pyramid loomed over the bottomland, 100 feet high, with terraces broad enough to plough. The land was full of monuments, and no one living could say who had raised them. A few of the early observers looked clearly and understood what they were seeing. In 1811, a young lawyer and traveller named Henry Breckenridge walked the site, paced out the great mound, counted the lesser ones spread across the plain, and grasped at once that he was standing in the ruins of a vanished city as grand, he wrote, as anything in Mexico. He set it down in a letter to his friend Thomas Jefferson. The observation was accurate, generous, and almost completely ignored. The country was not ready to hear it. For to accept Breckenridge's plain conclusion that Native Americans had built a metropolis here was to accept something inconvenient about the people whose land was, at that very moment, being taken. What the country preferred instead is one of the stranger chapters in the history of how people explain the past. Faced with these mounds, clearly ancient, clearly the work of a settled and organized people, many of the new arrivals reached for almost any explanation except the obvious one. They decided that the native peoples they knew, the nations they were in the very process of dispossessing, could not possibly have built such things. And so they invented builders. The mounds, it was said, must be the work of a vanished race, a lost civilization of superior strangers, who had raised these monuments in some forgotten age and then been wiped out. Tragically, by the ancestors of the Indians, the candidates multiplied with each retelling. Some said the mound builders had been a lost tribe of Israel. Some said Phoenicians or Egyptians or refugees from a drowned Atlantis. Some preferred Vikings or a wandering Welsh prince named Madoc or the Toltecs of Mexico marching north. The details hardly mattered. What mattered was the shape of the story, that a noble, civilized people had once flourished here and had been destroyed by savages, and that the land had therefore already been taken once, by violence, long before any European arrived. It is not difficult to see why such a story was welcome. A nation expanding westward, removing the people who already lived on the land, found in the mound builder myth a quiet absolution. If the true builders of these monuments had been a vanished white or old world race, murdered by the ancestors of the very tribes now being pushed off the land, then the conquest could be told as a kind of restoration, even a revenge. The myth turned dispossession into inheritance. It let a new people stand on top of someone else's monuments and feel that they, somehow, were the rightful heirs. And while the myth was being told in parlors and pamphlets and on the floor of Congress, the mounds themselves were being destroyed. St. Louis grew, and its mounds were in the way. Through the 1800s they were leveled one by one, their earth carted off as fill for railway beds and building lots, until the city that had been named for its mounds had almost none left. The greatest of them, the Big Mound, was demolished in 1869, its soil hauled away by the wagon load to raise a railroad grade. Inside it, as it came down, workers found burials and ornaments copper, and strings of marine shell beads carried up from the distant Gulf the grave goods of people who had been somebody, scattered now into the spoil of a construction site. Across the river, the eastern precinct fared little better. Its mounds flattened as farms, and then a growing industrial town spread over them. An entire second city of mounds, we now know, lay beneath East St. Louis. It was almost entirely erased before anyone thought to record it. Even the Great Pyramid itself, the one monument too vast to cart away, came close to being lost. In the early 1800s, a community of Trappist monks had settled on its lower terraces and planted gardens and wheat there, and left behind nothing but the name by which it is still known, Monk's Mound. In the century and a half that followed, it was farmed, built upon, and crossed by roads. A road ran over its first terrace. A subdivision was platted across the ancient Plaza. There was, for a time, a gambling hall on its flank, and later the highway and the billboards and the drive-in cinema crept close to its base. More than once, the largest earthwork in the Americas was very nearly sold, leveled, or simply allowed to wash away. That it survived at all is something close to luck, helped along by a handful of people, local historians, a few determined preservationists, eventually the state of Illinois, who refused to look away, and who fought, decade by decade, to buy the land back and set it aside. The slow correction came from two directions at once. The first was honest scholarship. Even in the myth's heyday there had been dissenters. Thomas Jefferson, decades earlier, had dug carefully into a burial mound in Virginia and concluded, from the neat layers of the soil, that it was the work of the native peoples themselves, an early act of something like real archaeology. But the decisive blow to the myth came at the end of the 19th century, when the Smithsonian Institution set a researcher named Cyrus Thomas to survey the mounds systematically. across the whole eastern country. Thomas had begun, by his own admission, half believing in the vanished race. The evidence changed his mind. His report, published in 1894, laid out case after case demonstrating that the mounds had been built by the ancestors of living Native American nations, that there had never been a lost race at all. In the world of science, the mound builder myth was finished. It lingered far longer in the popular imagination, as comfortable myths tend to do, but the ground itself kept yielding the truth to anyone willing to dig with care. And in the middle of the 20th century, the digging became urgent because the modern world was once again threatening to pave over what remained. In the 1960s and 70s, the great interstate highways were being driven across the country, and their path ran straight through the Cahokia site. What might have been a final act of erasure became, instead, one of the largest archaeological undertakings ever mounted in North America. Teams moved ahead of the bulldozers in a race against the concrete, opening the ground in long trenches, and in those salvage excavations the lost city began, at last, to speak. A researcher named Warren Whitry, puzzling over strange arcs of large post holes turning up in the dig, recognized them for what they were, the great circles of red cedar posts that would come to be called Woodhenge, a calendar built to track the rising sun across the year. And Melvin Fowler, mapping the whole site with new rigor and turning his attention to an unremarkable low ridge called Mound 72, uncovered the beaded falcon burial, the retainers laid in rows, the pit of sacrificed young women, the stark, eloquent evidence of a society with rulers powerful enough to take lives and to order an entire cosmos around themselves. The salvage digs, meant only to record what would be lost, instead revealed a civilization. The work has never really stopped. Radiocarbon dates pinned the city's sudden rise to around the year 1050, a founding so rapid that archaeologists have called it a Big Bang. New surveys traced the wooden palisade that was raised and rebuilt around the central precinct, the great borrow pits the earth was dug from, the careful planning of the plazas. And as recently as the 2000s, ahead of a new bridge across the Mississippi, archaeologists were given one last chance to dig into the buried precinct beneath East St. Louis and found, under the modern city, the remains of that vanished second center, including evidence of a great fire that had swept through its packed rows of buildings long ago. Piece by piece, dig by dig, the scale of what had stood here came back into focus. From all of that grew the recognition that should have come centuries earlier. The site was protected, made a state historic park, its great mounds stabilized and climbed now by visitors on a wooden stair, rather than threatened by plows and bulldozers. In 1982, Cahokia was named a World Heritage Site, placed by the wider world on the same short list as the pyramids of Giza and the stone circles of Britain, an acknowledgement, at last, that what stood above the Mississippi floodplain belonged among the great monuments of human history. But the deepest part of the restoration is not a plaque or a designation. It is the return of the people whose ancestors built the place to the center of its story. For most of the time that Cahokia was studied, it was studied as something abandoned, a puzzle for outsiders to solve, its dead treated as specimens. That has changed. Laws now require that the human remains and sacred objects dug from the mounds be handled with consent and returned where they belong. the descendant nations, the Osage above all, whose own traditions and homelands tie them most closely to this stretch of the Mississippi, along with the other Degihan peoples and the wider family of Mississippian descendants, are consulted on the care of the site and the handling of their ancestors. They speak at the place their forebears raised. They remind a forgetful country that the builders of Cahokia were not a vanished race, not a mystery, not a myth, but the ancestors of living nations who never left this continent at all. There is a quiet justice in that. A city that was abandoned by its own people and then erased by those who came after is being slowly returned in memory and in meaning to the descendants of the people who made it. The mounds that were denied are being acknowledged. The names that were taken away are coming back. And it is worth pausing at the very end on what Cahokia actually was. Not a colony of some old world civilization, not the work of strangers. A city that rose and flourished and fell entirely within North America, on its own terms, built by people who farmed the river bottom, read the sky, ruled and were ruled, believed and doubted, gathered in their tens of thousands, and then, for reasons we are still piecing together, walked away. It is the story of a civilization in full ambition and faith, order and crisis, rise and decline playing out beneath a sky the same color as our own, on ground a person can still stand upon today. What remains, in the end, is the earth itself. Most of the satellite mounds are gone, carried off as fill more than a century ago, but the heart of the city endures. The Great Pyramid still rises from the floodplain, its broad summit catching the last light of the day as it once caught the first light of the equinox sun. The plaza is still level and open where the games were played. The post pits of the sun circle have been marked again on the ground, and in the long grass that covers the lower mounds, the shape of a vanished city is still legible to anyone who knows how to read it. 100 green hills, a buried calendar, a silent plaza, and a single mountain of earth raised by hand, basket by basket, by a people who believed they were holding up the order of the world. They did not vanish. The city slept, and the truth slept with it, and now, slowly, both are waking. The great mound still stands above the river. The grass keeps its shape. The names return, one by one, and the city sleeps,